welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Karen Curvin, City Club President, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you joining us today at Sentinel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. We do have several elected officials in the audience today, and I would like to recognize U.S. Representative Suzanne Bonamici and City Commissioner Steve Novick. Today, Cassandra Profita will interview Dennis McLerran, Regional Administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But first, a few announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Chevron, Girding Edlin, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, Portland Timbers, and Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of our sponsors. Next Friday is the 4th of July, so we will not be holding a forum. We'll be back on July 11th for Trash Talk with Edward Humes, author of Garbology, Our Dirty Love Affair with Trash. City Club members, please join us on Tuesday, July 1st for our monthly networking event, Civic Drinks, at Elephant's Delicatessen on Corbett. This event is for members only, and it is also your last day to join City Club and receive great gifts and a discount. You can join at the door that evening or online anytime. Learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, City Club will be live tweeting at today's event. You can follow or mention us at PDX City Club, and be sure to follow the conversation by using the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We will have a Q&A session with our speaker at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards up high, and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of Q&A. And now for our program. On June 2nd, President Barack Obama announced a series of federal executive actions to reduce carbon pollution and announced a nearly $1 billion competition to fund measures coping with the effects of extreme weather. Among other requirements, the Environmental Protection Agency proposed that power plants cut carbon dioxide emissions 30% in coming years, a step to limit the gases that most scientists say contribute to climate change. Today, Cassandra Profita will interview Dennis McLerran on the President's Climate Action Proposal, the Portland Harbor Superfund, and Columbia River Toxics. Cassandra Profita is a multimedia reporter for OPB's EarthFix environmental news team. She covers Oregon and Southwest Washington with a focus on the urban environment and sustainability issues. She curated OPB's Ecotrope environmental news blog from 2010 to 2013. Prior to that, she was a business and environment reporter at the Daily Estonian newspaper. She's a fellow with the Institutes for Journalism and Natural Resources and a recipient of the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environment Reporting Award of Special Merit. Please help me welcome Cassandra Profita, who will introduce Dennis McLerran.
Thank you all very much. So now I'm going to introduce Dennis. Dennis was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as the Regional Administrator for Region 10, leading a staff of over 500 employees with the responsibility for an annual budget of over $300 million. He was sworn in on February 22nd, 2010. As the Regional Administrator, Dennis oversees the implementation and enforcement of the federal environmental rules and regulations in the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska, including 271 tribal governments in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. Before moving to the EPA, Dennis served as Executive Director of the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency and has been involved in a wide variety of state, local, and federal issues and jobs in both the public and private sectors. Dennis has over 30 years of experience as an advocate, attorney, and administrator working on the environmental, land use, and climate issues. Dennis is a native of Washington State, a graduate of the University of Washington and the Seattle University School of Law. He has been a Puget Sound area resident for all of his adult life. And I think Dennis wants to make a few opening remarks regarding some of the things going on in his world.
Thanks, Cassandra. It's great to be here in Portland, and one of the great privileges I have as Barack Obama's regional administrator for EPA Region 10 is to be the regional administrator where we have communities like Portland. Portland is one of the greenest and most progressive communities in the nation, and it's a great honor to be able to work with folks in Portland on the tough issues that any community faces. And Portland has always been a leader, and it's my job to help continue that leadership in Portland and work in partnership with folks down here on some of the really tough issues. And even the most progressively green communities face environmental challenges, and that's true of Portland as well. We've got the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup that we're all working together on to get done, and we will get it done, and things I will say are going well on that at the moment, and I think we're going to get there in the next year or two in terms of having a really good cleanup plan out in front of the community. I think people are concerned here about air toxics, and I'll talk a little bit today about some of the challenges around air toxics and some of the things that have been done here in Oregon and around the country and that EPA is doing to address air toxics. And then Columbia River as well is a big issue for all of us. We own that river. The Willamette runs through Portland and joins the Columbia nearby, but we've got a very, very big river basin that has toxics challenges for the Columbia River, and we've got a strategy to deal with that, and we've got a lot of partners on that, and I want to talk a little bit about that in answer to some of the questions. And then also wanted to just say that the work that we're doing on climate at the EPA is really important work right now. The President, just 1 year ago, the anniversary of his climate action plan was just this last Wednesday a year ago. He feels that we have a moral obligation to address climate change, and it's our job at EPA to do our part through the mechanisms that we have, but every community, including Portland, has things that can be done, and Portland is taking some real aggressive, positive steps to deal with carbon emissions from the community here. So I guess with that, I'm ready to have the questions, but I just want to say thanks for all the great things that are going on in Portland. It's a pleasure to be the EPA Regional Administrator in a region that has communities like Portland that really care, and it's fun to be here today.
So Dennis, the President's new rule sets a target of reducing carbon pollution to 30% below 2005 levels. My understanding is that we're already on our way to that goal. So what do you see as the most significant change that this rule is making?
Well, the rule that we're talking about is our 111D rule. It's the climate rule that comes under EPA's Clean Air Act authority to address existing power plants. And existing power generation generates 40% of the climate emissions around the country, the climate pollution that drives global warming. And so it's a really important sector to address. If we don't address emissions from power plants, we're missing 40% of the problem. And so we've got an aging power plant fleet, many coal-fired power plants that are 40 to 50 years in age, and it's time for many of them to, in their business plans, think about their transition. Where are they going to go next? And the timing on this rule, I think, couldn't be better in that regard. What we're doing is putting forward a proposal. It's a proposed rule at this point, and it's out for comment, so we hope that a lot of folks will engage with us on getting it right. But the rule does have individual states having a target for reducing carbon emissions, carbon pollution in each state. And there's great flexibility under the rule to do multi-state collaboration, and in states like Oregon, that may be a really important component of it because Oregon is addressing its climate emissions ahead of many other states. The agreement to phase out the Boardman plant, the Boardman coal-fired power plant in Oregon, puts Oregon in a very good position to be on the positive side of the target that we've set for 2020 and 2030. And the overall target for the country is a 30% reduction in carbon emissions. And Oregon has an individual target, as each individual state does, but Oregon is in a really good position with what's been done. And the rule provides flexibility for some multi-state approaches that could give Oregon an opportunity and an advantage going forward under this.
Yeah, so let me follow up on that. So in Oregon, we are planning to shut down the Boardman coal-fired power plant. We also import a lot of coal-fired power from other states. Will this rule address that?
Well, the rule indirectly addresses that because what we've done is we've said that each state has a target and each state has to come forward with a plan to address its carbon emissions. And where there are opportunities for states to combine and look at a multi-state approach to this, where, say, power coming to Oregon comes from Montana or power from Wyoming comes into Oregon, there's an opportunity, and we've given additional time under the rule. We've actually extended the time for putting together a plan from 1 year to 3 years for states that decide to do a multi-state approach to reducing carbon pollution. So Oregon is on its way, Oregon is moving forward, and coal-by-wire does come into the state. The state has to have an emission reduction target that looks at all of the power generation that occurs inside the state, but there's an opportunity for multi-state approaches. And one of the things I did here a few months ago was brought together the public utility commissioners from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and the Rocky Mountain states with the utilities and with the environmental directors for each state to start some discussion about what the challenges were, what the opportunities were, and frankly to educate EPA about what the dynamic was in those states where there is some coal-by-wire, where some states are coal-heavy and other states are hydro-heavy, and what opportunities that creates.
Would a multi-state solution be kind of something like a cap-and-trade system?
It could be, but you know the ultimate choices are what states have to design. It might be just a multi-state agreement in terms of how power is produced and dispatched. So there's lots of different ways it could be addressed, and cap and trade might be one of those.
Will this rule ultimately result in higher electric bills or other economic impacts for the Northwest?
So we've done quite a lot of work on that, and our belief is that by 2030, the power costs per household should actually be lower. And while the rates are projected to be a bit higher, the overall costs of electricity per household should be less because of the efficiency measures, because of the opportunities that this will create for states to actually put in place better energy efficiency requirements and incentive programs. So we think actually our national projection is that power costs per household will actually be lower by 2030.
And then what do you see as being the major benefits once this rule plays out?
Well, obviously, climate change is one of the biggest environmental challenges of our generation. I think going forward, if we don't address climate change now, our kids and our grandkids will not forgive us. We really do have an obligation to get this done. So the major benefit of this is that it makes us really address the power sector. It also speaks to the world that the U.S. is actually serious about addressing carbon and about addressing climate change, and that's a very important signal to China and India and other countries that need to step up their game as well. And we've seen some response in that regard already once we move forward with this rule.
So this rule isn't final yet, right? What might prevent it from taking effect?
Well, certainly we're in the process, it's a draft rule, we're in the process of doing a pretty unprecedented amount of stakeholder outreach. We did really an incredible amount of work hearing from utilities and individuals and businesses that were concerned about what a power sector rule might look like going into this. And once the draft rule is out, we're doing that again. We're really out in multiple forums talking to folks that this would impact, asking them for their input on whether we got the flexibility for states right, whether we got the targets right, and quite frankly, we're hearing some very positive returns on that. And so I think, going forward, what could stop us is potentially riders on budget in Congress. There are folks who don't want us to finish this and could put budget riders on either EPA's budget or other budgets that could impact our ability to finish that. So that's probably the biggest threat. Of course, there will be challenges legally to it as well, but we're pretty confident with the recent Supreme Court opinions that the authority is there for EPA to act.
Got it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Portland Harbor. It has been contentious at times. Where do things stand now? It's been about 14 years since the EPA first listed the site as a Superfund site. Where are we now?
Well, we're in that space right now of finishing the remedial investigation and feasibility study documents. And for Superfund aficionados, that's getting the alternatives right for the cleanup, getting the data organized in a way that allows us to make decisions on a proposed cleanup plan. And that's really going well right now. We're working collaboratively, chapter by chapter, with the Lower Willamette Group to get that work done. And we anticipate getting that done soon, and then moving on to a proposed plan, and then having a pretty robust community process around the alternatives in the proposed plan to determine what the final cleanup plan will look like going forward. So we're in a good space, and there's a very collaborative working relationship at this point going forward, and I'm energized about us getting it done and getting a plan out in front of the community.
Is one of the remaining questions on this site essentially how clean it's going to need to be in the end? In my mind, that's sort of the lingering question for me. But there's a lot of different contaminants on this site. What remaining questions does the EPA have?
Well, we've got lots and lots of data. The sampling that's been done in Portland Harbor is, quite intense. So we have a good profile of where the hot spots are and where the not so hot spots are, what activities there are in the harbor that could disturb sediments. And so, as in any sediment cleanup, and this is a river bottom sediment cleanup, you have a diversity of techniques and solutions that can be brought. And what drives that is the data and the science. If you've got a really hot spot that has a lot of river activity in it, where that pollution is getting stirred up and put into the water column, you're going to need to dredge that, and you're going to need to take it away and dispose of it somewhere else safely. But if you've got a section of the river that has low levels of contamination and has clean sediments coming in on top of it, it may be a natural recovery, which means that it's clean enough to leave in place, and if it's not being disturbed by either currents or by barge or tug activity or propellers that might come through, or currents that are strong, you can have a natural recovery remedy in that location. And then there's spaces in between where we do things called enhanced natural recovery, where you do capping and maybe even use some advanced techniques like putting carbon in the capping material. So this will be a cleanup plan that includes sites that have a diversity of potential remedies, some more intense than others, and that will be driven by the science, and it will be driven by the data and the conditions on the river and on each site.
And that's what you're going to lay out in your final plan?
Well, that'll actually be laid out in the proposed plan, and then there'll be a very robust opportunity for community input, lots of community forums and lots of exchange back and forth with the property owners, and that will be the basis on which the comments that come out of that process will be the basis on which we put together a final plan.
So how does this cleanup compare with the one in the Duwamish, which in Seattle was listed about the same time?
Well, it's similar in some ways and different in some ways. I think the biggest difference is that it's twice as big. The cleanup in the Duwamish is a lot smaller site than Portland Harbor. But they're both sediment contamination. They're both driven by legacy pollution that occurred by our predecessors back in history. Portland Harbor has a few more hotter hot spots in terms of contamination than the Duwamish, but they're both sediment cleanups, and the techniques that are being employed and the science that's being employed in the lower Duwamish is exactly the same kind of science and the same kind of cleanup techniques that'll be applicable to Portland Harbor.
What's the status of the Duwamish River cleanup at this point?
Well, the Duwamish, we're past that point of a proposed plan. The comment period on the proposed plan there has closed, and we're now at the point of putting the final plan together, and that will come out to the public probably within the next 3 or 4 months. And in the Duwamish, we've been very fortunate there to have a number of early action cleanups. So before the final plan is even released, we'll have commitments to clean up 50% of the contamination on the river bottom there in advance of the consent decree. So that's probably a significant difference.
So how does the Portland Harbor work relate to the issues of toxics in the Columbia River? Some of the contaminants we worry about are the same. What's the relationship between the two issues?
Well, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Willamette is a tributary to the Columbia, but much of the contamination at the Portland Harbor site is contained within the site, but and the resident fish that some people eat are one of the big drivers there. But in terms of the whole Columbia River toxics issue, up the watershed is where the contamination in the Columbia River comes from. Everything from pesticides applied to agricultural fields, to PCBs that are legacy from building the dams, to a variety of chemicals that are used in everything, all kinds of manufacturing activities historically. So the challenge with respect to the Columbia River as a whole is one that there's a great organization here in Portland, the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership, that's worked with us in partnership and with many organizations in partnership to come up with a strategy to reduce the toxic loads to the river. And I think the congressional delegation in Oregon, Congressman Blumenauer and Senator Merkley, are just about ready to introduce the 2014 Columbia River cleanup legislation, so that could be a big thing to provide funding and planning work around it. But the Willamette is a tributary and it does contribute, but the Portland Harbor site is really a more contained area.
To what extent does the EPA have regulations that stop toxics from entering the Columbia River?
Well, certainly everything that we do in terms of point source permitting. So in most states, Idaho, we write the permits, but in Oregon writes the discharge permits for industrial sources, pulp mills, and others that have discharge into the river. So those regulations have really ratcheted down the end of pipe pollution that goes into the river. But the big challenge is non-point sources, the activities that you and I do fertilizing our lawns, the activities that have runoff going into storm drains, oil leaking from cars, brake pad dust that gets washed off the roadways and into the storm drains. So those non-point source challenges are much more difficult to address because they come from hundreds of activities that are pretty ubiquitous. So how we get at those successfully is a combination of efforts, everything from what Oregon Department of Agriculture is doing with farmers to what Oregon DEQ is doing with industrial sources to what we're trying to do in terms of getting communities to work on projects like Portland's Big Pipe, which really eliminated a huge amount of combined sewer overflows into the river. So lots of different strategies, but big challenges on non-point.
Do you see some roadblocks to cleaning up toxics in the Columbia River?
Well, of course, the sort of ubiquitous nature of non-point source pollution makes it more challenging, and I do see that to get at that and get at that effectively does take an organized effort. So funding for the agencies that are engaged in that, everyone from the local governments to the state environmental agencies and agricultural agencies, to really have the resources to address the problem is pretty critical to being able to be successful on that. And then really individual responsibility, education, public education about what the things that we do mean in terms of the river. We have to own that river. The Willamette River is Portland's river. The Columbia River is Oregon and Washington's river. It goes upstream to Idaho and Canada. We all have to own that, and public education around the things that we do that can make a difference in improving the toxic load in the river is an important component of that as well.
I've also read about and reported on other kinds of pollutants that are entering the Columbia River, essentially pharmaceuticals, like things that we are using and that aren't getting cleaned up in wastewater treatment plants. What is the EPA thinking and doing about those kinds of pollutants?
Well, again, that's a public education issue in large part, because the way we dispose of our pharmaceuticals, if you flush it down the toilet, it's going to end up in the river. And many of those are endocrine disruptors. They do cause hormonal changes in the fish and in the critters. And we need to educate the public that that's not an appropriate way to dispose of pharmaceuticals. Communities are developing collection programs. Hospitals and clinics and others are doing that. So getting at that issue is certainly one very direct way of reducing that impact.
So let's talk a little bit about Portland's air toxics. The City Club has done its own report on these toxics. Will you remind us what the term air toxics refers to?
Sure. Well, air toxics is a broad term that refers to the 180 plus chemicals that have been designated as toxic, that are put into the air from everything from the emissions at the tailpipes of our cars to industrial emissions to wood smoke that comes from wood stoves. So it's a broad variety of sources that put chemicals into the air that end up getting into our lungs or deposited on the ground and into the water.
And how does the EPA regulate these pollutants?
Well, there's a variety of ways. Some of the more direct ways are certainly our air permitting requirements that address this. We have what we call MACT standards, M-A-C-T, Maximum Achievable Control Technology standards, that apply by industry sector, and what those do is industry sector by industry sector require the industries to put best control technologies in place to reduce the air toxics. Our tailpipe rules for automobiles and diesel engines, because a big part of the challenge comes from tailpipe emissions. Wood stove standards. Oregon has a wood stove standard, and EPA does as well, and we're in the process of tightening that national standard. In fact, the cleanest source for home heating is not a wood-burning device. It's a natural gas-fueled device or a propane-fueled device, so we encourage people to switch out to those. But there's a lot of different regulatory approaches that we have, but the sort of ubiquity of air toxics makes it a very challenging arena to be successful in. And so I would say that Oregon has one of the most progressive programs that I've seen. I'm an old air guy, as you said in my introduction, and Oregon has really done a great inventory of its air toxics, particularly in the Portland area. It's done toxics monitoring. It's really come up with a strategy, and we at EPA do what we call the National Air Toxics Assessment, that does modeling for toxics right down to the census tract level and looks at the reporting that we get from all the sources in communities, and people can go right to our website and look at what the air toxics challenges are in their neighborhoods.
Isn't most of what we know about air toxics from modeling as opposed to actually testing for them? I mean, how much do we actually test for them?
Yeah, well, air toxics modeling is very expensive and quite a challenge, and most areas of the country don't have an extensive network of air toxics monitors. Portland, I think, is fortunate to have at least one air toxics monitor in place, but most communities have none. And we've gotten pretty sophisticated in the air modeling around air toxics. So that air toxics modeling is a very, very sophisticated and useful tool in determining what the challenges are. And Oregon has categorized its challenges and set priorities. The City Club has done that as well. Those are helpful efforts for people to know that wood smoke is a big driver, and controlling wood smoke is important. Tailpipes and diesel emissions are important as well. So Portland and Oregon have done a very good job of framing what the challenges are, and modeling is a very sophisticated tool that's useful in meeting those challenges.
Would it help to have more monitoring, like to know more about exactly what is in the air and where it is?
You know, that's a great question. Not necessarily, and I think the nature of the challenges are that they are mostly from area sources rather than point sources these days. Again, we've ratcheted down the smokestack emissions, and the biggest challenges are us: wood smoke, our cars, our diesel engine vehicles. We know where those sources are. They're on the freeways, they're on the major arterials, and we know what the solutions are to that. And so more monitoring isn't always the answer, and certainly paying attention to the issue. You can have hot spots as well, and if for instance, there is a chrome plater in your neighborhood, that would be good to make sure they have the best controls in place and that they're using them and they're maintained. And that's what the agencies actually do, is check up on those sources.
Yeah, why don't you talk about how the EPA works with DEQ to reduce air toxics? What is the EPA doing on this?
Well, we've certainly in the past provided some funding to the state of Oregon. We have what we call 105 grant funding that does direct money to the states, and Oregon has used a fair amount of that for developing its toxics reduction plan and some of the monitoring that's been done. And I would say that Oregon and the city of Portland are probably in the top 10 in the country in terms of having really focused in on the problem and identified what the sources are, and really having invested in developing a strategy and informing the community about what some of the challenges are. So that's where we assist. Is we do the national air toxics modeling, the state agencies do some of the monitoring, and then they do more sophisticated community work to target it down in their neighborhoods.
It sounds like if a bunch of the sources of these air toxics are coming from vehicles, that emission standards might make a difference. Is that EPA's purview?
Yeah, again, I worked 10 years ago with Oregon DEQ to develop the California car standards for Oregon, and that's very beneficial because the California car standards were more stringent than the national standards. And so here in Oregon and in Portland, there's a more robust vehicle electrification program than probably just about anywhere in the country outside of California. And so, yes, there's a number of things that are being done and have been done here that are pretty advanced.
And so, my understanding too is that there's sort of a different way that we regulate. You talked about technological standards, the way that we keep air toxics from getting into the air at high concentrations. But that's different from how we regulate other air pollutants. Can you explain why that's different, how it's different from how we regulate criteria pollutants such as lead or sulfur dioxide?
How many hours do we have? So the criteria pollutants, the pollutants that we set national standards for, are for smog and for ozone, fine particulate standards, and there are national standards that apply, and we do have national monitoring networks that address those. But those are, a small suite of 3 or 4 pollutants. And Oregon has really met the challenges on those. It's in attainment of those national ambient air quality standards, but air toxics come from this wide suite of chemicals. There's hundreds of chemicals that are toxic, and so you can't regulate it by setting an ambient air quality standard and monitoring for it, and then developing approaches like you do with the criteria pollutants. So it does require work like Oregon has done, which is to identify what the air toxics challenges are here, and then focus people's efforts on reducing the sources. And it's just a different regulatory scheme, and it's driven by the fact that it's a sort of much broader suite of chemicals.
And what are the health concerns associated with some of these air toxics?
Well, again, it's a wide range of concerns. Air toxics, in high doses are harmful to infant development and brain development and so on. There are some that are endocrine disruptors that can cause genetic damage and so on. But again, that's high concentrations, and so what we're more concerned about is chronic exposures, and really trying to focus in on how we can reduce the overall air toxics load, and then deal with the hotspots or sources that might be a particular source that might be driving it.
So what's happening throughout your region with air quality issues such as air toxics?
Well, again, I think we're fortunate to live in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest has much cleaner air than California or Texas or many of the eastern portions of the country, where there's a much higher concentration of industrial activities and much more population density. But that doesn't mean we don't have challenges. We do. Diesel emissions are one of the air toxics that, again, we've developed tailpipe standards for, but there's a legacy fleet. There's a fleet of we buy diesel vehicles because they're powerful and they last for a long time. The truck on the road might last for millions of miles, and when it's done on the road, it might become a drayage truck in the port. And so getting at those legacy vehicles is a pretty important piece of this. I see Kevin Downing from Oregon DEQ at one of the front tables up here. Kevin's put together a diesel emission reduction program for the state of Oregon that's a very good example of how you get at those legacy fleets by incentivizing changes, and Oregon has some tax credits that incentivize that as well.
And so is that sort of some of the low-hanging fruit, maybe, to addressing air toxics, is just getting rid of old diesel engines?
And certainly that's a key one. California and Washington and Oregon have all targeted diesel emissions. EPA nationally has targeted diesel emissions both in terms of our new engine standards, which are 95% cleaner than the pre-2007 engines. And we have a Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, which has us around the country investing in technologies to retrofit existing vehicles out there. In Washington State, I worked on retrofitting all of the school buses in the state of Washington because we had some of the oldest and dirtiest school buses in the nation. So lots of that work has gone on, and it's been very successful work. But there's much more that could be done. Those engines do last 10 and 20 years. If it's a ship engine, it might stay for 50 years. If it's a locomotive engine, it might stay for 30 to 40 years as well. So legacy engines is a big challenge.
It sounds like a lot of that is maybe more voluntary changes to diesel engines. And I feel like there might be a parallel here with the carbon dioxide emission rules, where you're actually putting some pressure on older coal-fired power plants to clean up their emissions. That's quickly going to become less optional. Could something similar happen with diesel engines?
Well, I think probably not likely because we're now almost 10 years into EPA's much tougher tailpipe standards, so the legacy vehicles are turning over. And it's much harder to economically justify a rule that requires every single engine to be retrofit. So we have dealt with it through incentives and tax credits and voluntary programs, and those have been pretty effective. In Washington State, where I'm most familiar with, virtually all of the school bus engines have been retrofitted. Virtually all of the transit buses have been retrofitted and run cleaner fuels. So I think we're turning the corner on that. We still have some big challenges with ships. adopted through the International Maritime Organization for big ocean-going ships and the coastal ships, regulations that are phasing in between 2012 and 2015 that reduce the emissions from those ships by 90% as well. And we're seeing conversions to liquefied natural gas that are even cleaner than that and address climate change. So all of those are things we're working on.
What are the biggest environmental concerns that you hear from people in your position? What are people worried about?
That's a great question as well. I think most people are worried about what is going on in their neighborhood, what's going on in their community. Are we making a difference in terms of the health of their kids? And it ranges in everything from people that live next to a cleanup site to people that live near industry to people that live near a proposed mine. One of the biggest challenges that I've had in my 4.5 years at EPA has been with respect to the proposed Pebble Mine in the Bristol Bay watershed, where there's a proposal for the world's largest open pit gold and copper mine at the very headwaters of the Nushagak and Kwijak River, where communities have depended on those salmon for 10,000 years, and where there's 14,000 fishing jobs every summer to harvest half of the world's sockeye salmon in that one watershed. So those are the kind of things that I hear about.
Okay. And is there pressure on the EPA to do more than it's already doing to protect our air and our water? What do you pressure to do? What do people ask you to do that there may be some limits on how much you can achieve?
Well, absolutely. People expect the Environmental Protection Agency to be there to protect them, and so it's absolutely appropriate that they keep our feet to the fire, and they do. I get lots of community engagement and lots of pressure to do more. But we're a nation of laws, and we're very science-based in our approaches to how we apply those laws. So we want to be applying those laws in ways that are scientifically sound, technically sound, and actually make a difference. So when we do something in a community, we're doing it to make a difference to people that live in that community, but we're doing it in a way that is also compelling to the sources, that they actually can see that we've done our homework, that we've done the science, that we're actually justified in taking an action. And that takes some time, and sometimes people are impatient with how much time it takes, but it's the right way to do it. And as I said, we're a nation of laws, and that's what we do, is we apply the laws, and we apply them vigorously, but some feel that we should do it more vigorously and more quickly, and that's one of the challenges.
Ocean acidification comes to mind as one of those problems where it's a water quality problem, but it's a lot bigger than that too. And there's a question as to can EPA's laws apply to ocean acidification?
Well, again, ocean acidification is largely driven by carbon emissions. So carbon pollution in the atmosphere being addressed is really the solution to ocean acidification. I think one of the key things we need to understand, though, is that we bought a lot of climate change and ocean acidification from the emissions we've already put in the atmosphere. And that's one of the public education challenges around this, is we really do need to get our carbon and pollution under control now if we're not going to fundamentally change our oceans and fundamentally change our environment. So the steps that we're taking at EPA to address carbon pollution and that the President's taking are absolutely essential for us to not see our oceans become more and more acid and inhospitable.
Yes, actually that is happening right now. It was just waiting till 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock is our transition time. So we had a couple of minutes, but let's move into opening up the Q&A. So if you have a written question on an index card, you can hold it up high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. And we will now take questions from the audience. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their questions. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of the City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Also, I will read at least one index card question. Okay, so we have our first question here.
Mr. McLerran, first of all, thank you for the great work you and your agency do. There are some major projects we would like to undertake in Portland to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We've got a $600 million bicycle plan that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We don't know where the money's going to come from. We would like to build high-capacity transit from southwest Portland through some southwestern suburbs. The local match on that is going to be hundreds of millions. We don't know where the money for that is going to come from either. But entities within Portland are going to be required to spend between probably $300 million and $1.7 billion on Portland Harbor. I wonder, do you ever wish that you had the power to say to a community, either you could spend $1 billion on a Superfund cleanup, or you could spend $300 million and spend the other $700 million addressing climate change?
Well, that's a great question, Commissioner Novick. I think my job as the EPA administrator is to apply the laws that I have jurisdiction over, and so I try and do that in a way that's responsive to the communities and follows the rule of law and does it in a way that's responsible and cost-effective. Your job as an elected city commissioner is to organize the public and come up with the funding solutions to respond and deal with that. But we're partners on that. And so we need to figure out the best paths forward that actually help us to do as much as we can, time it, phase it, work on it together in ways that make sense to our communities. And quite honestly, every one of those projects that you mentioned, including the cleanup of Portland Harbor, are things that I think the community can get behind. It's really the challenge on how do we space it out, how do we build public support for it, how do we come up with the funding to be able to do it in a rational way that doesn't break the bank for people. So that's why you ran as for elected position, is to help solve those challenges, and it's part of the reason I took on this job is to work through those challenges together.
Next question.
Mike Litt, City Club member. Natural gas is often touted as a bridge fuel to a cleaner energy future until we can get our renewables ramped up. But there's a recent study, I believe, from Cornell that shows that leakage of methane from the thousands of fracking wells is considerably more than had been anticipated, and these wells are mostly not regulated to prevent this or to even monitor it. Are you aware of this problem, and do you have any suggestions as what should be done about it?
Yes, the question addressed leakage of methane in the natural gas system, and we at EPA do believe that natural gas is a bridge fuel. It offers the possibility for 30 or 40% lower greenhouse gas emissions than some of the alternatives, but it has to be done in a way that is well controlled, and the states are primarily the regulators for fracking and development of natural gas, but we've been working in partnership with the states and with a number of the national organizations, whether they be trade associations or environmental organizations, that are working together on this to look at what it takes to make sure that the system is tight. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than CO2, and so you need to make sure that at the wellhead you're not losing methane. You need to make sure that in the transmission and compression you're not losing methane, and then in the delivery and use you're not having methane slip. So there's a number of areas, just like we faced with other motor vehicle pollution controls, we need to make sure that that system's tight and well developed and well controlled, and we're very much on that.
Steve Shell, member. Thank you for coming. The issue that I have with what's happening right now with the Superfund is the delay. We've been at this for 14 years, I think, thereabouts, and we're still kind of trapped in the middle of this. You've now put off the rod until 2017, I believe the date is. Chip Humphrey has left, and you're going to take 6 months to find a new person to replace him. What can we do to help you move this along? We know you're being under attack in Congress. You know you're having budget problems, but Portland needs to escape from this situation that we're in. It's hurting our port, it's hurting our employers, and it's hurting our jobs. What can we do to help you move this faster?
Well, you know, all of us want it to go faster. Superfund is a beast in terms of trying to get speed as part of the process. You know, you're right, EPA is under budget challenges. My region is going from slightly over 600 people to around 500 people in the region over an 18-month period. So we're resource challenged. But I've made Portland Harbor a top priority for us, and we are not reducing the staffing with respect to Portland Harbor. Even with retirements and attrition, we're actually ramping up our focus on Portland Harbor. I brought one of our senior leads, Lori Cohen. She's the Associate Office Director for our Office of Environmental Cleanup to the project a year ago. We are bringing more contract support, so we're very focused on getting it done and getting it done timely. But there's also the contrasting side of this, which is you've got to get it right. And we're working very closely with the Lower Willamette Group to get it right, because this is a big decision for a community. This is big dollars. It's really important, and it's a cleanup that will last for the long term, so we need to get it right. And that's where that intense work on data gathering and getting the reports right, and then putting the alternatives in front of the community and getting community engagement on those alternatives is pretty important, and that takes some time. So we're committed. It's a high priority, and we're bringing more resources to it rather than less, even when our overall resources are significantly less.
Ted Kay, City Club member, what will it take for Portland to become carbon neutral?
Well, those are great choices for Portland to make. And, you know, I think Portland has a leg up on that as we go. You know, you have a large amount of hydropower in your mix now. You have a lot of folks that love to cycle. I happen to be one of those. I actually brought my bike down when I came down from Seattle. You've got a lot of electric vehicle focus down here. But ultimately, a community has to come up with its own strategies in that regard. And I've been involved in the carbon planning for a number of communities now, a number of cities, and each plan is a little bit different. You know, some rely more on bikes, some more, you know, rely on offsets, some rely on really changing their power mix. And so for Portland, it's a suite of choices that are out there, and you need to make those choices. I can't tell you what those best choices for Portland are. That's up to you.
Peter Fenner, City Club. Has the EPA done any definitive studies of particulate matter along the major highways such as Route 5, which runs right through Portland? And in particular, relative to studded tires and the extra carbon and rubber and cement and whatever gets released into the air? Thank you.
We have not done any comprehensive studies along I-5, but we do know that motor vehicle corridors, because of the nature of the intensity of the vehicle traffic on them, do have high particulate emissions and do have you know, high air toxics emissions as well. That's why we're doing things like the tailpipe standards that we've been ramping up you know, time after time, and why we've done diesel emission reduction strategies. The tires and brake pads are a challenge as well, and there are some studies from universities that have been done on those. I saw one that University of Wisconsin did where they had a vehicle with mobile monitors, but we haven't done anything here along the I-5 corridor in Oregon.
Kurt Wabering, member. If you go out to the Columbia River Gorge, you can see mile-long trains of coal, filled to the brim and incidentally not covered, heading off to Asia to be burned, probably in inefficient plants. Is there any, a state approach in which it leaves it to the state to make regulations? You can imagine what Montana regulations would be. So my question is there any discussion at the federal level to basically leave the coal in the ground?
Wow. Our role in that at EPA is, certainly with respect to the coal export proposals that are here in the Pacific Northwest, and there have been as many as 8. I think it's reduced now. We have been very robustly writing letters to the Corps of Engineers, which has the permitting authority over those, to say that there needs to be a very robust evaluation of what the air quality impacts are, what the water quality impacts are, and even what the impacts of burning the coal outside of the U.S. would be, so that we have, for decision makers, a very robust analysis that they can then use to make good decisions about. As far as leaving the coal in the ground, I'm not going to touch that one. But I will say that we are seeing some pretty fundamental shifts in the U.S. because of lower priced natural gas and because of a set of renewable portfolio standards in various states. And I also talk with a number of experts who work in China and in Asia, and they're seeing some pretty significant movement on their part in terms of building renewables and looking at alternatives as rapidly as possible there. But it's a huge challenge, and part of the reason that we in the U.S. have taken on rules like our 111D for existing power plants is to do our part to show a pathway forward that is better going forward, and hopefully we'll see some of the others that are consumers of coal do the same thing.
I'm going to jump in here with a question from an index card. What is the EPA doing to ensure that as California phases out older on-road diesel engines, those engines aren't simply transferred to Oregon and surrounding states?
Well, that is not something that EPA regulates. I have seen states that have established their own programs in that regard. So I don't know what Oregon has done. I suppose that's really a question for Kevin Downing and Oregon DEQ. But our framing on that is a robust program in each jurisdiction to reduce the emissions from legacy vehicles is important. There are some scrappage programs as well. California is scrapping many of the vehicles rather than letting them go out. And certainly I've seen ports do that as well. The Port of Seattle has a scrappage program to scrap trucks rather than have them go elsewhere when they trade out to cleaner trucks.
I have another index card question for you. How will the EPA account for the historically and currently disproportionately impacted communities in the cleanup of Portland Harbor? As an example, homeless, African Americans, natives, and immigrants.
I didn't quite catch the last part of that.
The examples of these populations that are disproportionately impacted are homeless, African Americans, natives, and immigrants.
Well, environmental justice is a very high priority for EPA, and we do have environmental justice tools and environmental justice policies that we bring to bear as we make decisions. And so as we work on things like the Portland Harbor Superfund cleanup, that is going to be one of the criterion that we look hard at is what does this mean to folks that are either homeless or are high fish consumers and are more live in closer proximity to sites. And so that will be part of the community discussion that we generate. We'll actually actively try and engage with folks around those issues and make sure that we're paying attention to that as the decisions are made.
Okay, I'm going to invite Karen Curvin up to wrap up the program. It's time to go.
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. As we close, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Dennis McLerran and Cassandra Profita. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us next week.